when I go to want to input that user in my add user form and I hit that save button, I want to take that user object and not just pass it to the other form, but I want to pass it to the other form and actually save it somewhere. So that when I quit the application and I launch it again, I actually can see the users that I had previously entered. Great idea. Otherwise, your applications would be kind of terrible because every time you close the app, you would lose everything. So to do that, you have to go through and build that data access layer. And in doing that, you have to decide what is my data source going to be, because your data access layer is coupled directly to the data source that you're using. And we'll get into next week how you take this strongly coupled, strongly joined or related data access layer and make it so that it's interchangeable, so that it's not tightly coupled to the rest of the application. You want to be able to take that data access layer, pull it out of the application, and replace it with another one without having to rewrite the rest of the program. That's the end goal. So I'm going to right-click on my solution. I'm going to add another project, another class library, and I will call this my mod4 data access layer. And again, I get a new project added to my solution. Comes along for the ride with another class1.cs, which I will delete promptly. So I now have another project. When you think about building your data access layer, I always like to use the term you're building utilities, tools that you can use within your application to move and push and pull data. Think of them again like widgets or gears. They should be parts that you can use over and over and over throughout the application. So that's kind of rule number one. Sometimes they refer to this as the dry method, where you're trying to keep things as lean and simple and reusable as possible. The second thing that you want to accomplish with your utility class is you want to build a layer of abstraction. Does anybody know what I mean by abstraction? You're welcome to take a shot in the dark.
Like general, or like removed or something?
Yes, both. So the idea is that when you're taking an object, a user in this case, and you're going to write it to, and what we're going to do is we're going to take that user object and write it to XML. When we take that user object and we write it to XML, there's a series of steps that are involved in writing that user object to XML. The abstraction that I'm talking about is to make that process of writing that user one line of code. But in fact, it's going to take, to actually get it from a user in memory to XML, will probably take us 10, maybe 20 lines of code to accomplish. But when my form says I have this user object and I need to save it to XML, my form object doesn't care that it's writing to XML. It's going to say I need a user utility and I want to add this user to the XML, to the data source, using this utility. So I should simply say user_util.add user, and that's all that my form application needs to know about. I've abstracted away or removed the complexity of how that user is actually saved. What are the benefits of that? Easier to read code. It's more direct. I'm taking this user and I'm adding it. That's all you need to worry about from that layer or that level. You can then take the utility that's writing that user. Right now it's saving it to XML, and we can pull it out and replace it with another utility, and as long as it looks and functions the same, follows maybe a same blueprint, our code is unchanged from the presentation layer up. We don't have to go back and touch our form because that class, that new utility class, has the same methods and takes the same parameters as the old one. And it now becomes an interchangeable part. You get into very interesting high-level enterprise applications where your UI in your business layer, and then you actually have this, in the term now is broadly used as a middleware, where your business layer makes decisions based on the type of data it's working with, and this middleware then actually will splinter and connect to multiple data access layers. And depending on the data you're pulling from, comes from different data sources, it'll actually spin up different utility classes and pass them up and say, oh, here's the utility class you need to access this type of data. And it happens at runtime dynamically. You don't hard code, I'm using this data access layer, I'm using this data access layer. Instead it says, oh, you're trying to access student data in this system. It spins up an instance of that object, of that utility class. It says, here's the utility class you need to access that data. And then your UI goes, thanks, and goes and does what it needs to do. Completely unaware of where it's actually getting the data from, because it doesn't care. It just wants to know that I can make this call, I can get this student, and then that happens. And that's what you want to get to. Now, that, some people will say that adds complexity to the application. Some people say that adds simplicity. Honestly, it's a little bit of both, depending on how deep you get into it. But it gives you more flexibility in your app long term. And that's really where you want to be. I always like to joke and say that I prefer to be to the point where I have a good enough application written. When somebody comes to me and says, hey, can you do that? Sure. If I have enough time and or resources, there's no reason why I couldn't do X thing. Because my program is flexible enough that I can either bolt on something or swap out a piece that allows me to do that. So when you start thinking of enhancements and improvements and changes you want to make to your application, because writing the app is only about 50% of the work. The maintenance and the improvements and adding new features that keep people coming back to using your app or help make people's jobs or lives better is the rest of your time. So being able to do that quickly and efficiently for yourself, you know, they always say lazy people make the best programmers. So if you can make your job easy, why not do it the first time? Right? So, what we'll do here is we're going to create this utility class. So right-clicking on the data access project, add class, and I'm going to call this my XML user utility. Now I'll make that class public so that it can be seen by everything else. And then I'm going to add 4 methods, and these are going to be my CRUD methods. CRUD, C-R-U-D, create, read, update, and delete. So public, and then we'll say, I'm going to probably, let's start off with void delete user, and then we'll pass in a user object. Public void update user. Public, and then we'll do user as my return type. Add user, and this user will be my template that I'm going to do my add. It'll base my add from, and then public, I'm going to return a list of user. Get all users. It's really hard to see, isn't it? Now, if your code's like my code, it's probably got red squiggles all over the place if you're following along. Some of these red squiggles are complaining because it doesn't know what a user is. Does someone understand why it doesn't know what a user is?
We haven't created it yet.
We haven't created it yet. What was yours?
So say you haven't like instantiated it yet?
Haven't instantiated yet. Well, it's a type, so the instantiation isn't necessary at this point. We have created a user class.
We did?
You're not using it.
I'm not using that class? Okay. Yeah, I created it. It's under my business layer. There's my user.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yes.
These are references. I don't have it connected, right? So there's no relationship, there's no reference. So right now, these three projects, they're like their own little world. That whole idea of scope and isolation, I mean, that's literal. Like, they literally don't know about each other. Yes.
So they'd be like 3 separate folders. And if you went to the documents folder for Visual Studios, you're like zipping your project.
Yes. So let's look at it from the physical level first. Right-clicking on my solution, I'm going to say Open Folder in File Explorer. When that opens, I literally have 3 different folders now. One folder for each project. If I go into Mod 4, then I see all of my classes for my form. If I go into my business layer, I have these folders, but the only class that's in here is user.cs. One class, physically separated from the rest. And then if I go into my data access layer, I have my XML user utility, one class, separated from everything else. So they are physically separate and independent, which is how I want them to be to a degree, because I want to be able to grab one piece, pull it out, replace it with another one. So they need to be in isolation by design, unless you have interdependency. So when you think about how you're building your application, there's probably going to be some dependency between the layers. And you have to decide which layer is the independent layer. Which layer can live without the rest. And typically that is your core layer. So I kind of gave you a hint. Which layer is our core layer?
One that has perform the name.
Yes! So the business layer typically is your core layer. Now, that may be more of my convention and how I write my code, but I look at it as it's kind of that business analogy of what's your core business. What is the primary function of your application? Well, your business layer is there to model the primary function of your application. So at this point, this application doesn't do much. I understand that. But when you go to build your application, when you're going to build your AdventureWorks application, your final project app, you've got those databases, or I'm sorry, you have one database, AdventureWorks, so you have those tables. And those tables have customers and products and orders. Well, your core business is dealing with customers who are buying products and placing orders. So inside of your core, you'll want to have a class that represents a customer and a product and an order. Because regardless of whether you're using a SQL server, a web service, an XML document, your core business is always tied around customers, products, and orders. That is the core or the anchor point of your application. So whether it's a Windows app, a web form app, a mobile app, you're always dealing with the same business or goal. So your business layer typically becomes your core. And then everything kind of sprouts around that. So your business core generally should have no dependencies on other projects in your solution. And I'm sure there's probably a edge case where you would still need to make that happen. But eventually you'll have one project that is the independent project. And if you find a case where you have the core is dependent on this and this is dependent on that, and those pieces are, Visual Studio will actually yell at you and say you have a circular dependency. Everybody can't be dependent on everyone else. Somebody has to be the foundation of the app. One piece has to stand independent of the rest. And if you find that you're stuck where you can't do that, then you probably have something architected wrong. So, side note, what we're talking about, as much as we're talking about code, is we're really talking about software architecture today. So, keep that in mind, that this isn't just a Microsoft thing or a C# thing. This is just a good rule of thumb about how you architect your applications. So this can apply in Objective-C, Java, C++, whatever, you know, there's a whole bunch of different languages. Ruby on Rails, all those things. So, in our case, our business layer is our core. We then need to say, okay, who needs to have the first level or layer of dependency? Well, in order for our data access layer, we flip back here, to be able to manage a user, and by manage I mean delete, update, add, and get, it needs to know what a user is. So we have to add a reference, we have to make a dependency and add that reference from our data access layer to our core business layer. So to do that, we'll go to our data access layer project. You can honestly right-click on the project itself, or you can right-click on references. References gives you a much smaller list than the entire project. You can go add references here, or if you're just under references, which is my recommendation, right-click on references and choose add reference. Choosing that, it'll probably bring you up in one of these 4 side segments. The one that you want is solution. And what it'll do is it will list for you all of the other projects inside of your application. So you only get 2 options, but there's 3 projects. You cannot have a dependency with yourself. It's that whole like being married to yourself thing. It's weird. So you have to be dependent on something else. So it only gives you 2 options. It's minus the project you're in. In this case, we're going to be dependent on the core business layer. Now I selected it, but if you see here, there's actually a checkbox. I actually have to check the box next to the reference. That has screwed me up so many times. Like I'm in here, I'll click it, highlight it, hit OK, and I didn't actually add the reference. So make sure you check the box. And hit OK. So you'll see, and it might be hard to see, but you'll see under references now, we now have, along with all the Microsoft stuff and the system stuff, we also have mod4 underscore business layer underscore core. So we've now established a dependency relationship between those 2 projects. Now we still have red squiggles. Anybody want to guess?
You have to do using.
Have to do a using statement. This project name becomes its own namespace. So we actually now have a namespace called mod4 business layer core. So if we control period is my preferred method, or if you click on that accelerator, it'll pop up and say, do you want to add the using statement for mod4 business layer core? Because we now have a reference, a dependency, we can now see what's going on inside of that other project. And everything lights up green and happy. So by adding that reference, we're actually able to peer into the other project, into the other class library, the other DLL, and see the classes that live inside of it. The same holds true is if we went out and downloaded an SDK from a third party, for say if you're connected to an Oracle database, you go out and you download the Oracle, what do they call it, like the ODK or something like that. You'll go out, you'll download it, it'll have a whole bunch of documentation, and maybe like 1 or 2, or possibly, depending on the size, 3 DLLs. And they say, here you go. And you look at that and you read all the docs, and you're like, okay, this sounds cool, but how do I use it? You would go through similar steps. You would add a reference, and instead of referencing something in the solution, there's a browse option on the left-hand side there. You browse, you go find that DLL on your hard drive, and you pull it into your project. And then now you're referencing that DLL that's compiled, but you have access to the classes and everything inside of it, just like you do with your own code. And you use those classes to actually do the job that you need to do of connecting to an Oracle database in that case. These exist for everything, honestly. Facebook has its own APIs, so it has its own SDK. You can get .NET classes There's wrappers basically that do that. Twitter, most of the Microsoft products have them. Everything that you're dealing with within the .NET framework is really just compiled into one of those DLLs. So the system core, the system.windows.forms, the system.data, all of that are just DLLs that come when you download the .NET framework. So the last piece is these last two squiggles are simply here because we're saying we're returning a user or a list of users in both cases, and right now we're not doing anything. There's no code in there, so it's balking, saying, well, you're not returning anything. So the simple solution in the short term is I'm just going to return null in both cases. And that'll at least make the compiler happy. So if these calls are made, they return nothing, but we're at least they're returning a null value, but it's at least returning something. So we should be able to F6 build, and that was a successful build. So everything up to this point is valid.